In this episode of our Waxing Confidential series, Bobbin and Steve Wax unpack Trump's federalization of the National Guard and the deployment of the Marines to LA, exposing the legal overreach, historical echoes, and chilling consequences of this show of force. It's all coming up on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 69, recorded Wednesday, June 11th, 2025. Waxing Confidential, Trump's use of the military advances his authoritarian agenda. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center, and I'm back with Steve Wax for another episode of Waxing Confidential. We'll jump right into it. We'll try to just get to the meat of this. This past week, we saw the deployment of the federalization of the National Guard and the deployment of Marines in LA, which has now escalated the constitutional crisis in the United States. But it's confusing. So not everyone is completely clear on what's happening. So we thought we'd use this opportunity just to provide an overview and engage in an introductory conversation about what's going on in California and perhaps what this foreshadows for what's to come. I think one of the things is this is something that we had anticipated and were worried about. I know civil rights groups, including ourselves, had started preparing legal analysis and trying to understand the powers between the state and the federal government as it relates to the deployment of National Guards and how it could be used prior or when Trump got elected, because we saw this as an inevitability. But Steve, do you want to just kind of walk us through generally what has happened in California? Can you give us a basic structure and overview of what's going on there?
I'll do my best. It is confusing, and confusing in part because of the content of the executive order that the president issued a few days ago. The executive order said that where protests are occurring or are likely to occur. It's very interesting. We've got to keep in mind this order is not an LA-specific order in response to protests and or violence in Los Angeles. Anywhere is what this is addressed to. And it's so interesting and perhaps illegal or unconstitutional, authorizing the use of force in places where something hasn't even occurred. Just someone makes a prognostication. Well, it's likely to occur in New York, Peoria, Mobile, Alabama. So that's one piece of it. Another piece that is, I think, important to understand is that the president said that he is calling up the National Guard into action under the his command for up to 60 days, or at the discretion of the Secretary of Defense beyond that. And in other places in the country, that is the other places than Los Angeles, he's again delegating to Secretary of Defense Hegseth the authority to call up the National Guard to protect federal functions and property anywhere he deems it appropriate in his discretion. So unlike the other situations in which presidents have called up the National Guard, this call up appears to be broader and not defined geographically or defined temporally by time. Another thing that it's important to look at in terms of this order is the authority that President Trump asserts and the authority that he doesn't assert. So our Constitution and statutes include, in the Constitution, designation of the president as commander-in-chief of the armed services. The assertion of the power to either call up the National Guard or use federal troops by the president as an inherent part of his power under the Constitution, that's unusual. That's particularly dangerous because there are statutes that Congress has passed with respect to the power of the president. So you've got in his order reference to section 12406 of chapter 10 of the U.S. Code that says that the president is authorized to call up the military in articulated limited circumstances: invasion, rebellion, or when the standard civilian state, county, local law enforcement is unable to execute the laws of the United States, and so this would include then federal law enforcement, by the use of the regular force. So you have to have, as a matter of presidential authority, some facts to justify using the military under this statute, under the authority that Congress gave the president. And those facts include that, in this instance, the LA police or the California State Patrol or a county sheriff can't execute the laws. That is, can't protect property. And, in this instance, there's also the question of protecting federal property. But federal property can only be protected by the military if federal, state, and local law enforcement can't protect it. And as we watch the videos of the protests, and I'm sure the people who are on the ground in Los Angeles are seeing, California law enforcement people are out in force. They're arresting people. They are shooting what look like paintballs. It's called non-lethal force for crowd control. They're using tear gas. And I think it would be difficult for the president, the Department of Justice, to prove that the local law enforcement is not capable of executing the laws. And if they can't establish that, there's no justification for using this provision to call out the military. Statute which President Trump did not rely on in his executive order is what's generally called the Insurrection Act, a statute first enacted in 1807. Also in chapter 10 of the U.S. Code, it's sections, if anyone wants to read it, 251, 2, 3, and 4. And there, too, you find this language about invasion, rebellion, and being able to execute, and the laws protect property by regular law enforcement means. In the statutes that provide for the use of force, whether it's the Insurrection Act or 12406, whether we're talking about U.S. troops or National Guard that is federalized, you also have to read what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, which is important to note, is found in the criminal codes. So, a little history here, I think, is important. Civil War ends, and the federal troops, the northern troops, occupy the South. They're present in the South. And what I learned in school, we talked about this last time, the radical Reconstructionists in the House of Representatives were passing laws by the Senate, signed into law by President Johnson, and sometimes vetoes by him overridden, to make the end of slavery meaningful for the freed Black people in the South. And for a number of years, it was quite successful. Again, repeating our last conversation, 2,000 Black people elected to offices throughout the South. People were allowed and enabled, to register to vote. People who had fought on the Southern side were removed from office and had to take oaths of allegiance. Well, in the election of 1877, the pressure from the economic and political forces in the South that had been opposed to Reconstruction, participated in, and of course, the Northerners, did this as well, brokering the election of 1877 to get a Democrat in power on the promise that the federal troops would be withdrawn. As part of that, Posse Comitatus Act, 18 USC, the criminal code, 1385 was passed, which makes it a crime to use military force within the borders of the United States to enforce the laws, unless specifically authorized by act of Congress or authorized by the Constitution. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act, now for almost 150 years, has been understood to prohibit use of troops for law enforcement purposes, of military troops for law enforcement purposes within our borders. So when trying to look for a justification for what the president has done, talked about what the statutes require in terms of fact. What is not ever been decided is, what does the inherent power of the commander-in-chief mean? How is that limited by these statutes? We know that it has been understood to be limited by legal memoranda that have been produced by the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House, by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, to say, hey, presidents, and this is both Republican and Democratic presidents for decades, you don't have the power inherent in the Constitution to say, I'm going to nationalize the National Guard and have them go do whatever it is, enforce the law, protect federal property, et cetera. Historically, we've seen in the since the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, used federal troops in Little Rock, he did so because there was a specific statement by the governor of Arkansas: I am not going to comply with the court orders for desegregation. So the federal authority was directly opposed by the governor of the state. So federal laws could not be enforced by, were not being enforced by local law enforcement. The governor had the state troopers, literally on the side of those people who were opposing the entry of Black students into the Little Rock schools. Eisenhower sent in the troops, and while the Southerners railed against that, federal invasion on their, state prerogatives, as a matter of law, there wasn't much, question, but that Eisenhower was permitted to do that. When the National Guard was called out in Los Angeles by President Clinton, it was under the provision of the statute that addresses the National Guard that says that the president can federalize the National Guard at the request of the governor. And Governor Wilson, in 1995, give or take, when Los Angeles was beset by riots after the acquittal in the Rodney King cases, they requested federal assistance. So the statute permitted President Clinton to federalize the National Guard and send them in. That has not happened here. To the contrary, Governor Newsom and the Los Angeles mayor have both said, we don't need you and we don't want you. So anyone who Googles this online will find any number of commentaries about whether President Trump has a valid constitutional or legal basis to do what he's done. So why don't I stop there and come back at me with a question if I have not been clear enough in my description so far.
Well, there's a few things. I think I was just looking up the riots. That was in 1992.
No, sorry.
Yeah. But it's interesting because of the different powers that you're talking about, like why you would, and they seem all sensical as to why the federal government would have to send in or federalize the National Guard to send in federal resources to help enforce laws that aren't being enforced, like you mentioned in Arkansas, or in the case of a governor requesting that additional support. In this instance, we don't have that. I mean, this all sort of got kicked off because ICE began what was seemingly arbitrary, erratic, intrusive raids in that part of Los Angeles, the small part of Los Angeles, where, they were just basically creating terror within the community, and the community there pushed back. And so, it was a hornet's nest that was intentionally kind of kicked up to kind of create this. But, I think the point that you also made, and this is, we were talking about this prior to getting on, the irony of all this, or these edges that I can't square, the local law enforcement within Los Angeles was, I would say, violently engaged in suppressing the protests. Like, it didn't seem like that was a problem for local law enforcement they didn't seem like they were having any issues, and had all the military gear and equipment that, the National Guard and the Marines have, and things like that. What I think is interesting is you kept on using these words, like invasion, rebellion. And I think what has been noticeable over the past week is when we start hearing the rhetoric from administration officials using these words. This is an insurrection. This is an invasion. They're pointing to the fact that people are waving Mexican flags at the protests. Can you speak a little bit about the rhetoric that you're hearing, and how now the rhetoric, it seems to be sort of an after the fact thing, where now they're trying to use the rhetoric to justify the actions and potentially justify further actions based on this broad executive order?
Sure. The rhetoric is important, and I think that it's also not new with this administration. Going back to the very beginning of the term, and the beginning of the efforts to deport people, the administration and Congress, and when we talk about what's going on, we should not limit ourselves to talking about the president. It's the president and all of the people in the administration who are responsible for doing his bidding, and the people in the Congress, particularly the Republicans, who are not doing anything to stop it. So with the flights, the deportation of the Venezuelans as alleged gang members, that was justified as a response to an invasion. And we talked about this in our discussion about habeas corpus, that the Constitution allows suspension of habeas corpus in the event of rebellion or invasion. And they are in not giving any process to the people who were being deported, and in talking about, well, we may suspend the writ of habeas corpus, they were saying we have been invaded by the Venezuelan gang. So talking about invasion or rebellion or insurrection, this is part of the rhetoric that we've been hearing now for 5 months. Second thing about this to keep in mind, and going back to this order and the similarity to so many of the other orders that President Trump has issued, is his declaration of an emergency. And with respect to the tariffs, with respect to immigration, with respect to DOGE and some of what it's being asked to do and permitted to do, the president declares an emergency. And to be sure, Congress has authorized the president to take certain actions if there is an emergency. But as a number of federal courts have already held, factually, there are no, I should say there are no emergencies. His use of some of these emergency powers has been declared unlawful because there is no emergency, or what most of the courts have said is that what Congress meant by an emergency is not what the president is declaring. There ain't no invasion. There ain't no insurrection. And in thinking about the rhetoric from both a legal perspective and the broader, political and just social perspective, if you declare everything an emergency, let's say the exception swallows the rule. If you declare everything an emergency, nothing's an emergency. And if you declare everything an emergency, and you're permitted to do things, exercise authority that Congress intended to be exercised in very, very limited circumstances, you're expanding the scope of presidential power to a point where there are very few, if any, limits on it. So I think the rhetoric is tremendously important and tremendously dangerous, both in terms of our psyches, our understanding of how the government should interact with the citizens, and the citizens should interact with the government. And what's the difference between a dictatorship, and what's the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy? I think we talked about this when I referred a month or so ago to the Weimar Republic and in Germany with the their Article 48. Well, if we find we have an emergency, if we find that things are bad enough, we can suspend all of our rights. That's not a democracy. If the president of the United States is permitted to declare an emergency because some people are sending fentanyl across the border, and American people are buying it, and some of the product is just being made here, well, that's not the type of emergency that Congress contemplated, at least as it has been understood up until now. Part of the problem that we have as a society is that neither of the branches of Congress has stood up and said, whoa, this is not what we meant. The Republicans, one or two have broken ranks. And I'm sorry, I forget the name of the Republican congressman who said recently, I'm not going to follow my party off the cliff. One out of 200 and whatever they have now, 221. Yeah, in one or two of the votes in the Senate, two senators have refused to go along with two Republican senators with the party. So it's difficult to say this is not what Congress intended when the current Congress doesn't appear to care.
Yeah.
When the current Congress is so chilled by whatever it is that they fear the president will do to them, that they won't open their mouths. Now, of course, there is a genuine basis for fear. Attorney General Letitia James of New York, who won a $500 million settlement, or verdict, whichever it was, against Trump. They're now investigating her for some fraud. The judge in Wisconsin, who allowed a person who was not documented to walk out the back door of her courtroom, charged. Officials in Newark, New Jersey, who wanted to inspect a federal detention facility run by ICE, threatened with and charged with crimes. Well, that's dangerous stuff when the president directs his Department of Justice to act in that way. And it's interesting, one of the commentaries I read pointed out that in 2020, when there were protests going on against Trump near the White House, and he wanted to use federal troops, his attorney general, his secretary of defense at that time said, no, we don't do that. The current attorney general, the current secretary of defense are appointed in part because they have pledged what appears to be absolute fealty to the views of Donald J. Trump about the extent of presidential power. If they are indeed, views that he actually holds, as opposed to views that are handed to him on a piece of paper by some of his, minions from Project 2025, and or other, thinkers from some of the, think tanks that have been unhappy with what they perceive to be, limits on presidential power.
Well, just building on that point, when we're talking about the dangers of what's happening in the chill, I mean, we're seeing the deployment, the federalization of the National Guard, the deployment of the Marines in California, a Democratic state, left of center state, politically speaking. And this broad executive order that says, wherever protests likely may be. But you couple that with red states like Texas, which I'm looking at a headline that says Texas prepares National Guard for protests. And then part of the sentence is as Georgia threatens domestic terror charges. And so you have these red states, that will use their own infrastructure, local infrastructure, the National Guard, where you don't need that federalization. So we have this choreography that's happening to suppress political opposition, protest, in these different states. And you also have this, this propaganda machine that then begins to show, like you're saying, like using this rhetoric, this invasion that's happening in these blue states. We're going to make it peaceful. We're going to restore order in these blue states and these blue cities. And that's rhetoric he's been using for a while, whether it's Chicago, New York, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, calling these cities, horrible cities and things like that. I don't know as much as if I had a question or I mean, in the last few minutes, I have a couple more quick questions to ask. But like, any thoughts on this I don't know, what's emerging now?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that, Bob. And one is, while it's not North versus South, in some respects, it's a continuation of the Civil War. The focus of the protests is on the deportation of non-white people, the deportation of non-white people at the same time that the president invites and allows in white South Africans, and as reported at least, makes up stories and uses a video that has nothing to do with South Africa to supposedly justify actions being taken against white South Africans. There's a terrible danger in this. Governor Newsom has sued the Trump administration to stop, the federalization. Governor Newsom could do what Governor Abbott did and call out the California National Guard. The president has called up 2,000. Well, Governor Newsom could call up 10,000 members of the National Guard. Governor Abbott is calling up members of the National Guard. The president, under the executive order, could direct Texas National Guardsmen, actually National Guardsmen from any state, to go to California and police the Los Angeles streets. Yeah, there are some cinders glowing there in the ground in terms of where this all leads, and the redefinition of criminality here. If you want to consider a diverse workforce, if you want to say some of the things, Bobbin, that we are saying in these podcasts, the Trump administration could use the criminal law to say we are engaging in criminal activity.
Mm-hmm.
When the president says that I'm going to withhold your funds, Harvard or law firms, Perkins Coie, Jenner and Block, et cetera, if you don't do what I tell you you need to do in terms of teaching what you're teaching in the classroom or in terms of the clients you're representing, because it is something I, the president, believe is inconsistent with the federal civil rights laws, you're redefining. Congress passes a civil rights law in order to enable in 64, 65, primarily people of African American descent to vote, to ride buses, to eat at lunch counters. Well, now civil rights laws are being used not for that, but to say to a university, you can't teach civil rights in a way that says that we actually have a history of racism in this country and racial injustice. So the threat to use force by Governor Abbott or to use, to prosecute people, why is it domestic terrorism if a person paints graffiti on the side of a Tesla dealership? And that's what the Trump administration has been saying. We're going to use the domestic terrorism laws. Why is painting graffiti on the side of a Tesla dealership any more domestic terrorism than painting graffiti on the side of a 7-Eleven or a Chevy dealership?
Mm-hmm.
But they say it is. And if we get to a situation in which the view of one man as carried out by his minions determines this is the law or not, our country is in trouble. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens this Saturday with respect to protests against the expenditure of however many tens of millions of dollars to show, a show of force in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's what we see in Moscow. That's what we see in Beijing. The tanks, the rockets on the rocket trucks. That's not the hallmark of a democracy. And as you said before, he's threatened violence. Anyone who gets violent, there's going to be violence. You can't believe the violence you're going to be met with.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the federalization of the National Guard, the deployment of the Marines, and then you have these actors in these states starting to use their own local powers similarly, or, in furtherance of what it is. You have this rhetoric, you have this, what I would say is ludicrous, just show of force this weekend with the parade. But then you had also Trump at Fort Bragg yesterday, and what was a hyper-political, hyper-partisan speech in which he was talking to the military as if it was his personal military. This is, again, the line keeps moving and moving and moving as to what people, it's like, what do we debate as far as like what the Overton window is shifting so quickly on a weekly basis at this point, as far as what we consider normal and what we're debating. It is, I think we're in a very crucial window right now as to what comes next or how things may move. I mean, this weekend, we're recording this on Wednesday, June 11th, but this weekend on Saturday, there's going to be nationwide protests. So, it'll be interesting to see how different jurisdictions respond to those protests, how the protesters engage, and, how they're feeling. But yeah, I mean, I really do appreciate the opportunity to kind of go generally over, what Trump is doing. One question that I will say perhaps for a future recording, because I am curious more about your experience as the federal defender with federal law enforcement practices, is this idea of ICE coming into these jurisdictions without any uniforms, without any way of identification, and literally snatching up people from courthouses or off the streets, or coming in heavily militarized and, again, a show of force where they have people dressed up as if they're, invading a country to arrest two people or one person from a home or something like that. So I just leave that as a lingering sort of thought about your, as the federal defender. I mean, when you were dealing with federal law enforcement, these dynamics that were at play, especially post 9/11, like just your thoughts or, impressions and, things that you may have done in response to that.
I'd love to get back to that in detail, Bobbin. For today, what I'll say is that I have several very close friends who grew up in communist countries my age, so they, young in the 50s, 60s, and acquaintances who have come from other dictatorships, and they are appalled at what they see as what they experienced in genuine dictatorships, military dictatorships in a number of countries in their time. I mean, for federal law enforcement officers to wear hoods, to wear stormtrooper black uniforms, to take off their name tags, as happened in Portland during the protests in Portland in the early 2020s after the George Floyd killing. That's the hallmark of a dictatorship. That's not, the policeman doing his job, where who the policeman is, he is a member of the Los Angeles police force, whichever police force, an ICE agent, an FBI agent. It's very scary, and it's intended to scare the populace, which is what dictators do. Let's get back to that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time today. And yeah, we'll come back with another recording in the upcoming weeks, continuing to discuss what's happening at the federal level. And thanks again for offering sort of your insights, thoughts, knowledge, and analysis of what's happening in California. I think this will be very helpful for people. Until next time, it was nice talking with you, Steve.
Thank you, Bobbin.